All right, well, we're recording. Okay, so welcome to our faculty lunch and learn on the role of memory in learning. We will be recording these sessions now, so just so you're aware of that, and we'll be posting them on our faculty portal. And as usual, this is sponsored by the Provost's office, so thank them for some wonderful food. For people who are in Augusta, people are at home, I'm sorry we can't feed you.
Virtual food.
Yeah, virtual food, yes. We're giving you food for your soul. But in order for them to continue to do this, they need some feedback. So when we send out the evaluation, please take 5 minutes to fill out the evaluation on how you think the session went. That would be very helpful for us. So I'm going to turn it over to Marilyn to get started, and we're going to talk about memory today.
Okay, thank you, Anne. So this topic is actually a follow-up to the wonderful presenter, keynote presenter that we had at the Faculty Institute last May. So I'm hoping that many of you had a chance to attend that. But we've gone through the materials and chosen some of those chapters, and one of those chapters had to do with memory. So this is our first topic. Is Sharon, you want to shout out for the topic for this one? Yeah, like any good person who's
Sure.
calling on another person, it's to wait until you have some food in your mouth. And so Michelle Miller was our keynote presenter, and her book is Minds Online, which is a great read. Sharon?
For which she chose the painting by Salvador Dali called The Persistence of Memory.
Yes, because we want your students to remember what they have been studying. So our idea here was to, bring you into this particular topic this way. Anne?
Go ahead to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so take a minute and just reflect in your mind, what do you already know about how memory works?
Nothing.
I've forgotten if I ever knew. Well, repetition is good.
Okay, repetition. Okay, and then select a topic at some point in your experience as a student that you found particularly memorable. And if you need to jot it down, go ahead and do that, or just take a moment and just close your eyes and visualize what that experience was like. So think about what made it memorable. And then another thing to think about too, and we're going to come back to ask you about some of these things later. Who was your favorite instructor when you were a student? It's probably an easy one to remember. And why? Think about, what did they do? Why were they your favorite teacher? Oh, pop quiz. True or false? And I'm going to move these out of the way a little bit. The easier it is to learn, the better the content is remembered. So think inside your mind. Don't give the answers away yet. Whether you think that statement is true or false. True or false? Tests should only be used to assess student learning. True or false? It is better to mix up a bunch of topics when studying rather than studying one subject at a time. And then true or false? The more hours you spend studying, the more you learn, regardless of when you do it. You're not supposed to know the answers to these yet, but you will.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the strategies that Michelle Miller talked about with regard to this. And the first one is to look at the idea of tests. And tests should be a learning activity rather than just thinking of them as assessments. So, you know, oftentimes we have students who have real fears about, oh, I get so frozen when I take a test. If this is a learning activity, then the students stop thinking of this as a high stakes kind of panic situation. So from that standpoint, not only is it good for their memory, but it's also good, you know, in terms of their affect. Quizzes should be short and frequent. Okay, many of you have textbooks that have test banks where you can, you know, randomize the many questions that come out that are associated with that test. And so feel free if you have any questions. Next week we have a topic about tests in Blackboard, so, you know, you can ask questions about how to do that at that time. You know, you can have unlimited tests and count the highest grade, or a specific number of maybe 3 times having students go through a test. And all these are settings that you can easily set in Blackboard. And, you know, short answers have an advantage over multiple choice, but only a slight advantage. So you shouldn't be thinking that multiple choice is necessarily, you know, anathema. So you might say, okay, what are we going to do here? So what's the research that backs this up? And this is the memory research on the testing effect. You know, answering questions improves likelihood of remembering. You know, think about it from the standpoint of when you were in school and you got your test back. Did you look at the test questions that you got right, or the test questions that you got wrong? So actually, those wrong questions help you learn. Okay, more than any other strategy, testing has the greatest significance as far as benefits to the memory of the students. So something to think about. And the effect lasts several months. You know, how many times do we think of, you know, study and it's gone? And so you can have good effects if you have testing in your classes. Different test styles, you know, that isn't impacted by one test style is better than another. The findings are robust across all the different kinds of tests. And here's one that I think you might find interesting. Even when students don't get feedback about the wrong answers, they're learning from just having taken that test and thinking about that topic. Think of testing as part of studying.
And actually, if I could add one more thing in there, I just went to a conference on learning in the brain, and I heard some really great stories from researchers about studies that they're doing. And there is a collection of studies done on a particular middle school in the Midwest. And what they did was, for each of the classes, they had the teacher step out at the end of the lesson for 5 minutes, and they put up some questions on the overhead with clickers. And the students just answered the question, multiple choice question, and they divided the curriculum into 3 pieces. One part of the curriculum received test questions. Another part of the curriculum was just repeated up there on the slides, just like a statement about the concept or the fact. And then another part of the curriculum received no treatment whatsoever. And then they tested the students on all of that content at the end of the unit, and then again at the end of the semester. And on the end of semester grade, the content that was quizzed received a full letter grade higher than either of the other 2. And the other 2 showed very little difference. So the act of just showing that content again made almost no difference, but asking a question about the content gave them a whole letter grade higher. Very powerful.
I hate to interrupt. Is this the role of
Yes.
memory? It
Yep.
is, okay, because I had someone looking and we thought
Oh.
it was 210.
Great. Thank you. Yes, send them in.
Yeah, I think that's just a question of processing.
Yep.
You know, when students have to answer a question, they're actively processing. So it kind of makes sense that that is the effect that you have. Okay, the second study strategy that Miller talked about is spaced study. And you've probably heard about space practice before. You have a topic, you repeat it over time, you go back to it, and that actually has a better effect on memory than just mass, studying the night before. We tend to think that if we study the night before, it's going to be fresh in our mind, but actually it's that space practice that will give you a greater sense of what that topic is. Okay. Let's see. Some suggestions she gives is to stagger deadlines for your practice. And so recurring weekly schedule. Now she suggested this on different days. And I think one of the interesting questions is, what happens in your class? Because I know I had in my online class different days for different activities, and students said, whoa, with my schedule, just don't mix it up so much. And so I think it's a question of a rule of thumb there, that you have to look at your audience, you have to look at their schedule. And I really wondered, the students who were part of these studies, were they students who had quizzes as a supplement to their class, that they were traditional age students who were going to a classroom once or twice a week, or were these people who were taking solely online classes and had full-time jobs? So I think, that judgment that counts in is important. Okay, another thing is set up so that students can work ahead but can't fall behind. And I think there's another area where you want to use your judgment there, is that if students can work so far ahead, it undermines the idea of a cohort. That's important to get students conversing together on a particular topic. So keeping that in mind when you have this space practice. And that comes from the spacing effect. Again, holds up under lots of variation. If you look at that idea of, if you have 6 hours of practice, it's better to have more sessions rather than one long session. Think of it this way. You can turn that around and say to your students, hey, look at this. Your work schedule is actually a benefit if you break this up. And so if you coach them along as far as how to break up their studying into space practice. The whole point of this working is that idea that we're linking to various cues in our memory, there are various triggers to sending off to associate with whatever they're trying to remember. And so if you study at one point, you're remembering it in one way, you study it another time, you might be thinking of the topic in a different way. And so that's what I mean about different cues as far as trying to, then recall that information. Okay, Anne, you want to?
Yeah, so here's an easy set of numbers to remember: 10, 24, 7. So our brains periodically forget information, and forgetting is actually a really important part of learning, because again, there's that retrieval practice again.
Well,
think of
really
it.
Good to hear.
Yes. So think of it like you're going from point A to point B. The first time you might be bushwhacking through the jungle to get there. And it's the first time we are exposed to content, and sometimes it's that hard to get to the content. The next time you come back and you go through there again, there's a path now that you can walk on because it's already been bushwhacked. And then the next time you come back and walk through it again, now it's a dirt path because it's been traveled several times. And then pretty much eventually, the more you go back and forth and retrieve that information, it becomes a dirt road and then a paved road. And suddenly it's information that is so easily accessible, you could fly there and get to that information. So that forgetting piece is important. So there is actually, as you're going through being exposed to new information, if you pause right away at the end of that, within a few minutes, and you try to retain that information by recalling it again, your brain will start to get that signal that, oh, this is something that's important. Then give yourself a day, 24 hours to forget. And on the next day, try to recall some of that information. And then another important timeline that happens is about a week in length. So if you don't return to that information again in around a week, your brain starts to say, oh, this isn't all that important. So a good interval to give students is that at the end of whatever they're doing, so if they're reading, they should go back and ask themselves some questions of what they just read. Then the next day they should come back. They should just look at their questions, don't look at the book, and try to answer their questions without looking at the book. And then a week later, they should come back to those questions again and try to answer them without looking at the book. So that 10-24-7 really helps with that spacing effect. So let's check your knowledge. What is the testing effect? It increases memory. What else can you say about the testing effect?
That you learn from the mistakes that you made more than the correct answers.
Yes, when we get that kind of feedback. Yep. What else can you say about the testing effect? Anyone in Bangor want to chime in?
We have only one participant here. So what's the testing effect? Is it repetition?
So the mere act of recalling something makes you learn it better. How can you use it in your classes? So think now about what can you do differently in your classes.
Test short and frequently.
You sure could do that. You might even, if it's a face-to-face class, you might start it with 5 minutes of saying, take out your notebook and write down everything that you think you learned yesterday or last week or last time that we met. Just taking 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes out of class, not a huge deal, but they're really learning that information much more deeply. What is the spacing effect?
Hi, we're here in Bangor.
Yes.
Jessica. I liked this concept because spacing effect sounds like what it means. So it's about distributing information and content, or even like through due dates.
Yeah, distributing it over time.
Can we turn up the volume?
Yeah,
Is it possible?
I don't want to get too much of that feedback though. How can you use this in your classes? How can you structure your assignments?
So give different deadlines for things on different days.
Sure.
So different activities have a different deadline on a different day.
And to accommodate those people that do have the schedules where they can only work on schoolwork during the weekends, you might give them some time in advance. You might open up the lesson a week in advance and say, okay, you're not just going to get it all done in one weekend, you're going to get it done in 2 weekends. Lots of different ways to include that. Emotions.
Okay, so emotions have a really important impact on this topic of memory. One of the things is you want to make sure that any of the emotional content that you bring in there is germane to the topic. If it's somewhat related, it isn't going to have the impact. And oftentimes we use video and images because they do have an emotional impact. Don't make those optional. Make them part of an assignment, and your students will really remember those. If they're just placed in there for the students to get to, to have some background, they won't have as much of an impact than if they're part of a structured assignment. But one of the things that, because emotions really have an impact on memory, what you want to do is make sure that you let students know what's about to happen, because you never know what has been in their personal history that might trigger some negative aspect. So, let them know what's coming up and give them alternatives to that. Another way that you can use emotions is tell the students that they're going to be sharing their work publicly, because that usually heightens the anxiety that they feel, oh my goodness, here's something where other people are going to see my work. What are they going to think of how I did? So, that's another way of strategy for using emotions in your class. And where that comes from is the research that they found that emotions are really, they give you a sense of being really agitated, and so you're much more aware. But ironically enough, it's the negative emotions that are even more memorable. And so, you think of the student who's anxious about a test. You think of, why do we remember war stories and all these horrific images that we have in the public sphere rather than the very bucolic images? People are visually oriented, and this holds in the emotional realm too. So even more so than what you read about a transcript of what happened, say, a genocide in an area, it will have much more of an impact as if someone sees an image or a video about that same event. Okay, and to show you some of the emotion, think of this really famous photo from the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. And the Great Depression, and you can see the pain in this woman's face. So emotions can be either in terms of what your images are showing, and it also is what the person is feeling in terms of how they're doing. So it's kind of a two-way street. One of the things to remember about processing of visual versus textual materials is that visual materials is processed holistically, which means that we have more of a memory for holistic processing than we do for serial processing, the processing that you get with text. So that visual processing kind of takes in the whole image, and that's another reason why people remember images better. Yeah.
So how can you make your instruction emotionally engaging? So think that for a moment and then turn to the person next to you and share an idea of what you could do to bring emotion into your class.
Just put somebody on the spot and make them cry. No, well, my stuff is always very relevant and very, I don't know, I mean, it's laws, like, they live it every day. Yeah. And especially when I think that's one of my most family classes. Because I put a lot of video.
That's good.
That's good. Like the people identify it's always a huge class. Conflict resolution is another one like that. Yeah. But math, I don't know. Thanks for the help. Well, you could come in and take a video of me looking at a math problem and crying. And that would be emotionally engaging. Right, and that would really encourage my students to do that. Right?
Well, even something as silly as math memes. Just finding little pictures online with, stuff in it, a picture and a quote or something, that it's, they can recognize, oh, I feel like that,
Do you have any cartoons? No.
I see the civil engineer with his bridge falling down and going,
because he didn't do his calculations properly.
yeah, or Jolta's planes.
Are there any math? How about math, like Schoolhouse, was it Schoolhouse Rock?
Oh, yeah.
And math things? People still like it. It's all hard. This once a week thing is awful. It's like the worst way possible.
Yeah, to learn skills. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and what you're also doing is representational. So you're taking
Yeah.
out of context, you're looking for patterns, and how do you do these patterns, and what do these symbols represent? So really, to probably make it more emotional, they should find an example in real life where they see that concept, where they see the commutative property, or where they see PEMDAS or whatever.
Right. And there are so many of those.
And write a story. They connect emotionally with stories. So if they were able to write like their own word problems or things like that, that's one way of connecting.
And what about all those videos of the
We have a good time when the students get.
You know what? I am so old school.
But it's material they have to learn.
I teach.
So I know where they are, I know where they are.
Well, that's
There you go. Yeah.
So, I mean, my own. Yeah. Everybody else's. That's probably the only way I can survive it. But, yeah.
Anyone have an idea they want to share?
Emotionally engaging. Well, I was just saying that what I teach is it's easy to make it emotionally engaging.
Which is why.
Which is justice studies.
Oh, justice studies.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, like for example, my violence in the family course is very popular, and so is conflict resolution. But I think.
How do you get humor? How do you get that out of violence in the family?
Oh, she wasn't
What,
learning
humor?
humor.
Yeah.
I wasn't
Math
talking about
was
humor. I
humor.
was talking about like videos that are emotionally.
Oh, stuff like,
Humor,
I'm thinking the
okay,
wrong
so I'll
way.
give you an example of humor in it. So one of the classes, they have to learn about the rules of evidence, which is very, very boring. But I found this thing on YouTube. It's called like the rules of evidence put to song, and it's got like these
Okay.
little Lego characters who are involved in a traffic accident, and they talk, and the song's going on, and it's really cute, and people remember that stuff.
Yeah.
So that's humor.
Yeah.
Lawyer jokes are not going to go there, but
All right, so let's move on to our next tip.
Okay, strategy 4 here is steering students into deeper processing. Now, some of you may have heard about Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows. And it's our tendency as humans, if left to our own devices, we go towards shallow processing all the time. And so, one of your challenges as an instructor is, how can you encourage students to process more deeply? And the deepest processing comes from self-reference. So, when you talk about making your courses relevant, which is also part of motivation theory, that will get your students processing more deeply. So try and take your subjects and have students reflect on instances where they already know about that particular topic. Superficial processing, it almost assures you're going to have forgetting as a result of that. Let's see. And the underlying applied research is the interleaving effect, alternating between different topics and categories and skills. And so if you take a topic and over time, not just during a week or a module, but weave it throughout the course, revisiting it, looking at a particular concept in a different context throughout the course. So looking at the same topic through different lenses. Also, desirable difficulty. When a student is challenged, they're going to remember that topic better than if they aren't challenged. Now, the operative word here is desirable difficulty, that they don't feel frustrated of, oh, I can't do this. They have to feel like, okay, I can succeed at this, but I do have to put in the effort of that. And so that's the gold standard when you're trying to get your students to think about it and remember a particular topic. Let's see, so we've said some of these things C4. Oh, another thing that I want to mention in all of this is don't forget sleep. I know this isn't something you want to encourage during class time, but you know, for our brains to process those memories is that we need to have a good full night's sleep. And so if your students are studying late in the evening, and many of our students do, you see the timestamp of when they're posting their information. If they go to bed thinking about some of these things, that'll actually help their brain kind of put this all together and help them remember some of the topics that you're asking them to think about. Okay, the final strategy that Miller has for us is taking new knowledge and associating it with old knowledge. So this really is finding out what the students already know. Oftentimes we assume, oh, they should have these skills down or they should know this information, and that may not be true. So it's very important to find out, you know, what is their background with a particular topic, and or also to relate this to everyday experiences, to make those associations for your students. You can use the learning analytics so that if you do have the testing in your course, and then you find out what it is they do and they don't know about, you can emphasize the topics that they don't know and relate it to other topics where they do have that prior knowledge, and use prior knowledge to personalize their experience. And finally, I have used branching in online practice. And branching programs are those computer programs that if a student is doing, you know, just doing real well as they're going through a program, you know, through your questions, then it gets harder automatically. The questions get harder. Or if a student is constantly just missing the questions, then a branching program will drop down and make the questions a bit easier. So it adapts to the level that the student, where the student is. Okay, and this is based on the idea that memory doesn't fully engage with an absence of meaning and relevance. Okay, and so what do we mean by meaning? You know, some of the attributes that the researchers have found to make a topic meaningful is that it's active, your students are constructive, they're thinking about that, and building upon associations. It's intentional, that they're really concentrating on that you plan this out. You don't just assume that they're going to come up with their ideas by happenstance. They're authentic. You know, I think that's one of the advantages we have at UMA. We try to make very practical kinds of courses and relate, have students relate their life experiences and bring those into discussions. Excuse me. It's meaningful learning is goal-directed and collaborative. Okay, and I finally say key component is determining what students already know and shape that material to tie into these structures. You know, when we study expertise, an expert will already know these patterns. So oftentimes we try and have students act like a lawyer or act like someone who is practicing in the field. But remember, you need to bridge them to get them to that point, because experts will look at patterns and will have skills and behaviors where you see some of that bridging that they went through to get to that level of expertise. That's dropped off for them. So it's an important feature to keep in mind when you're bringing in that the idea of developing expertise and relating to prior knowledge. Yeah. Oops, wait a minute. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I'm still up here. Okay, so memory strategies. So here are our 5 strategies that these, even though this is about memory, these strategies can be used in any kind of learning situation. And so they're all built on applied memory research, but you know, some of the suggestions that she's given. Oh, I neglected to mention with emotions, what I do in my class, in a history class, before they study the French Revolution, they've got the picture of the guillotine, the movie Danton. You know, the first thing they get is the clip of the guillotine, and it's like, and there's a very negative association right there. But people will remember the French Revolution and what people went through as a result of that. And so not all negative emotions are bad.
That's what my students feel like.
Yeah, we are a mathematically challenged society, aren't we?
So, and I
Okay.
will add on strategies 4 and 5, so deep processing and making connections to what you already know. A great way of doing that is concept mapping, and where the students actually draw a visual representation of the concepts and how they connect to each other, and then connecting to what they already know in a deeper understanding of the concept as a whole, but also making connections to their personal lives too. And that's one of the things that we'll be covering next week. We'll be looking at the Blackboard apps, but we'll also be looking at, tests, but we'll also look at some concept mapping apps as well. So go back to that topic that you were thinking of earlier, that for some reason it was really memorable to you when you were a student. And now think about, did any of those strategies apply there? Okay, so take a minute to talk to each other and share which of those 5 strategies you've seen in practice. And if it's not, if it's not there, then maybe it was with your favorite instructor. Did the instructor use any of those 5 strategies? So let me put those 5 strategies back up here. And go ahead and talk amongst yourselves.
Mine was always a math teacher, oddly enough. So.
Do you want to come up and join a conversation?
You're pretty emotional in class.
I always got emotional. I always did.
I think we were into deep processing all the time. And it was like, you know, could do the new stuff in the machine, the old stuff. I'm not sure about pretty tests. Yeah.
Hi. Hi, Lisa.
Sure.
I think probably my middle grade thing is learning language. So Spanish, Orange, whatever. With lots of tests. Lots of Lots of answers. But people would talk to us. What I really learned was not from the teachers, but exchange students. And I make friends with the exchange students and I talk to them and then I learn about their lives and so that's how we learn it. Yeah. What do you think? I think probably English literature and that sort of ties into the emotional side of it. Feeling for Chinese or not. Feeling indignant. A lot of that emotion. I think really resonated with me. So those few things, you know, things that were more mathematical or something, you know, there's numbers or struggle more with that.
More often, huh? That's what you want, more anxiety.
Yeah, it's highly emotional and anxiety provoking. So, the guillotine is a perfect symbol for that.
That's your math symbol?
That's the math
Yeah, that's how you do division.
Oh.
Subtraction. Yeah.
That's what it felt like. I'm sorry.
All right.
most of my students. Yeah. You know what? I also had a really cool job in high school. We had a paper, and it actually went from being like this. We made a graph kind of little ridiculous, you know, no quality paper. Actually, a winning high school paper that looked like a real paper. We had editorial board, you know, that would meet every day, and we don't always have a police scan going on. We get passes for people to go down and cover the stories, send the photographer out.
Wow.
Dark room. Yeah, the administrators hated him because he was letting people out of school, so obviously they weren't learning anything. But it was the greatest class I ever took. I mean, it was, you know, like now, go write a press release. Sure, no problem. You know, it's just, it's the kind of class that just sort of stayed with me forever.
Wow.
It was awesome. But it was very relevant to everybody's lives. So, you know, you cover the news in your town, you get to get a press pass.
Wow, that's nice. One thing you might consider is that interleaving practice concept. It sounds so ridiculous. Why? I mean, I'm trying to teach my kids how to do fractions. Why on earth would I throw decimals in there too? Let's just take it one at a time. But yeah, if you mix them together, then they start to understand the broader concept of parts of a whole. You know, so by just throwing in different subjects, you know, and switching around through them, it's a harder learning process, but it's actually a better learning process because they start to see those bigger pictures and those patterns. So let's finish up with a little bit of some research here.
Okay, just a refresher on some of those applied memory research skills was that we have individual differences, and really in building up your expertise, what you're doing is building up your knowledge structures. And, you know, as we've been talking about, you know, all of your reactions, we've been hearing about how different people react to different kinds of courses and environments and likes. I think one of the best things we can do is give out a smorgasbord for our students so they can find what they really are passionate about. How about in Bangor? Did we have any reactions as far as, you know, reasons you had favorite teachers or some subject that you remembered? Or Chris, did I see you on the line there a while back?
No, I think we
lost Chris?
audio.
Okay.
Well, this is Jessica in Bangor.
There we go.
I was thinking of something from my freshman year in college. The professor would repeat something, and he'd often, I guess there was the testing effect. He wouldn't formally test us on this concept he kept bringing up, but he'd pause and let us like fill in the definition in class discussion. So it was almost like a kind of testing practice, just on the spot and verbal.
Good.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be big. It can be little.
Anybody else want to jump in with some of their remembrances of particularly effective strategies? Okay, well, I'll then bring up the testing effect, you know, just active remembering, the distributed practice, interleaving, which Anne said, and this is one I've got to find out. I've taken all the notes down on the research here because my own research was cognitive flexibility theory, and they didn't have this fancy interleaving effect for it. And what he called the theoretician Rand Spiro talked about that repeated revisiting of topics, which is very much like it sounds like somebody has that same idea and has given it a much fancier name. So it'll. And finally, the desirable difficulty. is also the applied research. You know, one of the things that I found interesting in rereading through this chapter by Miller was that unlike a course that I had in cognitive psychology, where we really differentiated between procedural knowledge and declarative knowledge, all of this information that Miller had really struck me as very much based on declarative knowledge, the facts, the information, as opposed to the skill and the procedure. So I'm interested in doing a little more, going into the footnotes and finding out, what she has to say about, is there a difference between the repetition that you may have with procedural knowledge as opposed to these strategies being more effective for your declarative knowledge.
Well, and I will say that at the Learning and the Brain conference I was at, there was a researcher who talked about not just the lower level remembering, understanding types of questions, which are the ones that we often think about. Well, we're doing retrieval practice, we're talking about memory. Do you remember something or understand it? Well, she actually did some research where she had, with graduate students, she threw in higher order thinking questions as retrieval questions. So they had to think back about what they just read and make inferences and some analysis kinds of questions, and then tested, again, the content that was tested and wasn't checking to see. And again, there was great improvement on those concepts when there were those retrieval practice opportunities. A really great resource I want to share with you is called retrievalpractice.org. So it's a website that has a lot of research on retrieval practice, but it also has a lot of practical things in there too. So there's some strategies discussed in there. There's a workbook that you can download for free to help you plan out where you're going to do retrieval practice in your classes. And Make It Stick is a fabulous book. It's very approachable and easy because not only were there two cognitive psychologists that wrote it, but there was also a science writer, or I forget who he writes for, the New York Times or something, that actually wrote with them so that it's easily accessible. You don't have to be a cognitive psychologist to read this book, but it really is, it covers a lot of these topics that we talked about in here and a few more. And we're actually going to be doing a book study on that next semester. So we'll send you some more information about that if you'd like to join us and talk some more about memory and how to make it stick.
And memory, remember, those who are good at memory, it's relating it to something meaningful. And so, Sharon, when you were talking about languages and remembering languages, and I'm thinking, oh, I never could remember all of those words that, they had no meaning for me. And yet I had students in my history class, how do you remember all of that? Well, I was paying attention. So another topic in Michelle Miller's book is that of attention, and hopefully we'll be talking about that in the spring semester.
Attention is very important. So are there any questions or comments or,
I have one. So where's memorization fit in all this? Because my background, we had to go to memorization. And not like, well, I'll say 40 plus years ago, I learned something, and I can still write it to the point, the comma, and exclamation point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Multiple lines of stuff. And so that's got to be in here somewhere.
Yeah.
But is it, the only way to do it was gut it out with memory.
Yep. So that was one of the repeated and spaced practice is one of those things which you probably did when you were learning to memorize it. You probably made flashcards for yourself.
Did that, or had people recite it to you, or you had to write it down, and if you didn't get it right, you weren't flying that day. I mean, it was pretty easy. So there was emotional control to that too.
Yeah, you were goal oriented.
Yeah.
And remember, that's one of the things you wanted to fly, so you were really going to put the time in and really pay attention to that. And whereas someone who may have been in the class who was not interested in flying wouldn't have the memory for that. So that investment that the individual student feels is a huge part of this.
Yeah, and memorization is not a bad word. that it's gotten a lot of bad press in terms of we want our students to be critical thinkers. We don't want them to memorize facts. Yes, we want them to memorize facts because they can't think critically if they don't have the work, you know, the body of knowledge to think critically with. So it's like those language classes where you can't have the conversation unless you remember some vocabulary. So
Well, and,
yeah.
and the automaticity,
Yep.
so that they can be thinking about that higher level because they're not struggling to say, what is 5 times 4? That they, you know, that 5 times 4 is just so, you know,
Automatic. Yep.
yeah, it comes no matter what, you know, and it will always be the same.
Those finger math, that's some
Your
great stuff.
4 hands.
Yes, we've got Andre waving at us in Bangor.
Yes, Jessica has a question.
Yes.
Related to what Marilyn just said about personal interest, I wondered about that as part of the research on memory. It seems like most of what I remember relates to when I got my PhD in, and I tend to forget everything that wasn't related to like my own specialty and my own investment.
So that's where attention really comes into play. And like what Marilyn was saying, goal-directed learning, where you do have the motivation. Motivation is really important. If you're not motivated, you're not going to learn it. You know, you can teach a dog tricks. You can take your dog to a dog trainer to teach them behavior. And unless that dog engages in that process with them, the dog isn't going to learn anything. And you're not going to pay for that service because, yeah, they might say, I taught your dog tricks, he didn't learn. Well, our job is to help our students to learn, not just teach them. So, yeah, the attention and goal-directed learning is so important, which we'll talk about next semester too.
Which means it's a lot easier when you're teaching in a field, in an area that you know your students, the only students you have in that class are those who want to be there. Yep. Because it is something that they are going to major in, or
that would be a treat.
but I know, okay, so I teach a gen ed history course, but my feeling is to be a voting citizen in the United States. Yes, you may become president, oops, but you know, you really should know some of what has happened in the world history, the most basic kinds of ideas. That's being a well-rounded, informed individual citizen.
Okay, so we are out of time. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. And for anyone who joins us online too, would like to continue the discussion, we will have space inside the Blackboard course that you're all a member of, the Faculty Lunch and Learn. So feel free to post questions, some ideas, some resources there. And thank you very much.
And thank you, Anne. Thank you, Marilyn.